I've always felt I have a sort of vulnerability to developing an issue around food.
My framework tends to be more of an intuitive eating lens. The bedrock of intuitive eating is about becoming more internally regulated, which is about listening to your hunger.
I really struggle to pick up hunger signals. I can struggle to know when I'm full until I am over full. It's not until I have eaten too much that I then realise. Let's say I am always going to struggle with picking up on hunger signs. And so you might have to think about it cognitively rather than intuitively, but then you can still put plans in place for yourself.
There is a lot more talk about autism and not eating enough, yet there are a whole bunch of autistic people who are saying, I struggle with overeating because of the fullness part, because I don't know when I'm full. I can't tell when I've had enough.
Autistic people are very monotropic thinkers, which basically means quite one-track minded. So if you're on this motorway of eating food, how difficult is it going to be to come off that track and stop what you're doing?
So how would it be for you then if you were watching a self-help video online and it's some annoying neurotypical person who's like, oh, well, you just need to start thinking about it like this and just think about it more like that? What kind of reaction is that likely to elicit in you?
Probably a frustrating one, because it's not that straightforward and it's not that simple. You said to me, how can people watch your content and figure out what works for them? But at the same time, like, our brains work differently, but we're not a different species.
Yes.
So
As some of you may know, I create content about how to heal your relationship with food and your body. And comments that I often get are around, how does my content relate to neurodivergent people? And I've been thinking about this a lot recently and how I can make my content more inclusive and affirming to people of all types of neurodiversity. As this is not my specialism, I have invited a good friend and fellow therapist, Carly Radford, to join us today. So I'm going to let Carly introduce herself, and I'm sure it will become very clear why I have asked her to join me today.
thanks, Sarah. Hello, my name's Carly Radford, otherwise known as the sensitivity therapist, and I work with all types of sensitivity and sensitive nervous systems. What I essentially mean by that is I work with people who are essentially born sensitive, either through feeling like they're a highly sensitive person, or people who are diagnosed or identify with being autistic or ADHD. I also work with acquired sensitivity, which essentially means people who maybe have experienced trauma throughout their lives or struggle quite a lot with anxiety and find the world quite overwhelming at times. I also identify with being a very sensitive person. I feel like everything about my brain and body screams sensitivity, basically. And a few years ago, I was also diagnosed as autistic and ADHD, which has also helped to make that sensitivity make a lot of sense. So thanks for inviting me on today, Sarah. If it's not obvious, I am a bit nervous about being here because you are very used to being in front of a camera and I am not.
That doesn't mean I'm not nervous. I'm here in a studio. I'm very much outside of my comfort zone. I would say that we're pretty good friends. We have a lot of back and forth on WhatsApp, and I have probably learned more about neurodivergence from you than anybody else. And there was something you said to me recently in a WhatsApp message where you spoke about spending 10 years in therapy, working on various things, feeling frustrated that you weren't able to change, and what was being missed by the therapist, and I think possibly at the time you as well, was the neurodivergent lens. Mm-hmm. And this is why I think this conversation is so important, because there will be people here who are neurodivergent, who are being missed in therapy and treatment and recovery programs. And also, a lot of people are trying to help and heal themselves through self-help tools, content like this, that's created by neurotypical people. Mm-hmm. So I guess first of all, starting with your experience in therapy, how do you feel like your neurodivergent, what's the right way of saying this?
What are you trying to say?
Your neurodivergent, like, I want to say experience, but it's more than experience because it's a sense of who you are.
Yeah, I'd still say experience.
Experience, okay.
Yeah.
Only 14 hours ago, I learned from Carly that to say neurodivergent as opposed to neurodivergence is...
Neurodivergent rather than neurodiversity.
Okay.
start again.
Well, no, I think we should leave that in, because this
Okay.
is like,
Yeah.
I'm wanting to learn here. There are other therapists out here as well. Like, the language is important, because language is what we use to create meaning. So what language is the most appropriate in our current understanding of neurodivergence?
A lot of people use the word neurodiversity when they mean neurodivergent, which I think is an understandable. People are still sort of like learning, I think, in relation to language. And I said this to you before, but I don't believe in like policing language. We're all on a journey, and there was a time where I used and said all sorts of different things, which I have come to very much change the way that I speak through learning from, autistic people, ADHD people, and about the language that they prefer to be used, me now included in the they. And so neurodiversity essentially means everybody's brains are different. We're all neurodiverse. Whereas neurodivergent is when there is divergence from what is classed as like the typical, which that could be a whole other debate about what that actually means. But essentially, when we're talking about people whose brains work differently than the typical, which is anything from autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, OCD, and many other things.
Aphantasia.
Yeah, which you know all about. All come under that umbrella.
And we've done a bit of a loop, haven't we, with the person-first language? Because I think way back when we talked about autistic people, and then there was a whole movement, let's say people with autism, and now we've come back to autistic people. Seems to be the widest acceptance. And maybe you could just speak to like why that is.
Well, from my understanding, person-first language, which is person with, first came about through thinking about people that have various different disabilities, and people feeling like they are more than their disability. So if you apply that to a physical disability, for example, or if you, for example, a person who has diabetes, if you say a diabetic person, well, people were understandably saying, well, I'm more than my diabetes, I'm a person first with sort of like diabetes. And so person first language sort of became the preference. But over time, many people, many particular autistic people, tend to prefer identity first language, in that being autistic isn't something you carry around with you. So people talk about like, I put it in my backpack and take it off at the end of the day. It's very much part of your whole wiring as a person, and therefore you are an autistic person rather than a person with autism. So now the preference for many people is for identity first.
Yeah, that makes sense, because it has often been, it's still used, isn't it? Autism spectrum disorder, is that still clinically, is that how it's used?
Clinically, that's still, yes, the diagnosis, although some people now prefer to say ASC, autism spectrum condition, again, condition. I still don't like that either.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. What impressed me about one of the comments I had recently on my videos about this was that someone had asked about how this video applied to neurodivergent people, and then they said that they had watched a couple of minutes of the video and then realized it wasn't for them. And there was part of me that thought, wow, they're that in touch with their experience that they are able to look at that and go, this isn't for me, this doesn't fit with my experience. But it got me thinking perhaps about a lot of people who've grown up neurodivergent, feeling different, feeling like the way that they process things or do things or think about things is wrong, that they might listen to my content and think that they're somehow wrong if it's more challenging or not possible to apply some of the things that I'm sharing. Thoughts?
Yeah, I can absolutely understand that. And I think because so many people have maybe grown up thinking their way of being in the world and perceiving the world is wrong, or are maybe even told that it's wrong, or that they need to change, or the way that they think or behave needs to be fixed in some way, then if you're consuming content that's essentially giving you advice or telling you to do things that doesn't quite fit with the way your brain works or thinks, then you may end up thinking that, well, maybe you try things and then they don't work, and then maybe you feel more wrong or like a failure, or maybe you're just not trying hard enough, rather than maybe that content isn't created with the way that your brain works in mind.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk about some of the challenges today that neurodivergent people have, particularly when it comes to struggling with food. We could start with maybe the early stuff, sensory. What are we saying about sensory?
So we're talking about the sensory element of food, particularly for autistic people.
Yeah. So there's a condition called ARFID, which is about avoidant restrictive intake of food, which isn't the same as other restrictive eating disorders, whereby it's not driven by an overvaluation of body size and shape. So sometimes I'll get messages from people, parents, who'll say, like, my kid is struggling with ARFID. How do I help them eat a wider variety of food? Because I think a neurotypical way of thinking about this is surely exposure to the different kinds of foods is what's needed. That is a very logical, neurotypical response. But what do you think about the idea of exposure for something like textures, flavors that are coming from, let's say, an autistic experience?
Because of the sensory elements around food, so if you think about textures of food in particular is a big one. So, for example, I really struggle when solid foods are mixed with liquid foods. So like cereal where it's solid, then in a bowl of like water, doesn't make sense to me. Or like runny soup with bits in, like minestrone. Again, it's like bits in that then just catch in your mouth.
Do you know what? Even you talking about that makes me go like this. And I like that stuff. The way you talk about it, I sort of feel that visceral. And because you've done an online scoring test and you technically meet the criteria for ARFID.
Yeah, I do, which really surprised me because I will eat a varied diet, but it's more out of forcing myself to eat a variety of foods because I feel like I need to, this is what's good for me, this is what you're supposed to eat to be a healthy adult. So I will eat a variety of foods, but it's not out of enjoyment. If I was to just eat what I wanted and what suits me, I would probably like really meet the criteria for ARFID. Yeah.
And this is why it's hard to speak to, I think, experience in a very generalized way, because there's going to be scales of this. For somebody with ARFID, there might be so much distress about eating certain types of foods, and other people a bit less so, but it's still there.
Yes.
So is there something there maybe about like a window of tolerance when it comes to this?
Absolutely. So if you think about it, if you was to now, I don't know, make me drink orange juice with pulp in it, for example, my level of, I guess, like distress, anxiety, panic, if we're thinking about the window of tolerance, if we're going up into sort of a hypoarousal state, that's going to creep up for me. It would probably creep up in a way that I can manage, and I could probably tolerate drinking the orange juice. But for some people, even just thinking about it, it could make them like vomit, for example. Just the idea of having to do that, and could create a huge level of stress that could, lead into, really just like high emotional distress, or in extreme circumstances, could lead somebody to have like a meltdown over it.
Yeah. Just on that, can you say a bit about an autistic meltdown? Because this is something I only learned about a couple of years ago, what it was and how it shows up. What is it?
Autistic meltdowns, and then the opposite of a meltdown, a shutdown in autism. A meltdown is essentially a really high period of distress, and one that is not within the person's control. So in children, it can, for example, look a bit like a tantrum, but when the kid's having a tantrum, there's a certain level of control within that, whereas a meltdown, it isn't. The person kind of loses the ability to control themselves. And so for autistic adults, for example, that might experience a meltdown, that can look like a really high period of like distress. That a meltdown is quite externalized. So you might see that as somebody sort of like really crying, or it could look a bit like a panic attack, or people could throw things, or sometimes even harm themselves in some way. Essentially, it will externally look like a very distressed person. And a shutdown is essentially an internalized meltdown. So that all happens on the inside. So the person might become very withdrawn, might not speak or lose the ability to speak, really go into themselves, might appear quite sort of like spaced out or staring off into the distance, or it could look a bit like a depressive episode, but is more sort of like short-lived.
Mm-hmm. So as adults, people who might be struggling with food, so much of the work that I do as a therapist is we look at childhood experiences. It's not the whole picture, of course it's not, but so much of the way we emotionally react with food, our habits, all kinds of things like that, get laid down in childhood. And I guess maybe then from your experiences in childhood, what were the challenges of being an autistic child who had some difficulties around food and eating?
I think for myself, I was quite lucky in that I certainly have sensory challenges around food, but not as much as other people. And there were certain things at home which I think, looking back, helped me without realising. So my mum, for example, often cooked the same meals on repeat. So there was a lot of meals I was very used to, and they would get rotated pretty regularly. There wasn't loads of variety in terms of lots of different types of meals. We often found the meals that we all liked and then had them repeatedly. And my mum was also somebody that very much, bought the things that I like to eat. And I would go through phases where I would really latch onto a particular type of food, and then that would be all I would want to eat. Like sometimes for months, I would just want this one food. So, my mum would buy it for me and it would be in the fridge. And then suddenly I'd decide one day, like, the idea of eating that food now makes me want to vomit. I'll never have it. And then it's like, I've never had it again. So I could get really into certain foods for a while. And then my mum would often keep buying those foods and be like, why aren't you eating that? And I'd be like, no, I can't have that anymore. Mm. And it would just go to waste. But yeah, I think I was quite lucky in that without realising it, my mum probably provided accommodations for me without fully knowing why. But for other people who experience that on a much more difficult level than myself, some people's diets might be like incredibly restrictive. It's quite common for autistic people to have what's called like the Binge diet, which is my favourite types of foods, but quite bland, quite plain food, and therefore not necessarily the most nutritious in terms of variety. And fruits and vegetables and things like that can be difficult for people to eat. So people can then end up with the label of being a picky eater or a fussy eater. That can be hard when you're going to school. There might be one specific type of thing that you like to have in the school cafeteria, and let's just say it's not in that day. You might not eat then for the day because you won't pick anything else. Mm-hmm. And even things like the social aspect of food and going to restaurants or family dinners or events, and not knowing the anxiety around not knowing what food is going to be served, if you have to eat beforehand, but then what it's like to sit there and not eat when everybody else is eating. So I think there's quite a lot of potentially negative experiences that maybe growing up autistic around food, that people can have.
And this is where people whose food problem get to the point where they need clinical treatment for it are really being missed. Because I know you've spoken previously in our conversations about safe foods, and safe foods can be an autistic trait, and it can also be a symptom of like a clinically problematic eating issue. Gonna have to go with that. So there's the aspect there that in a treatment capacity, you're going to be pushed away from your safe foods. That's going to be a whole part of what they think is going to help you to recover. And Live Label Free, I'll link to her details below because she's an excellent resource on like autism and eating problems. she has shared some of the ways that she's been missed in treatment, which includes things like not being allowed to look at the menu before you go to a restaurant, because that's considered an issue that you need to be able to not do. But that can be an autistic trait, right? How would something like looking at a menu before you go to a restaurant tie in with the autistic experience?
Well, like, I nearly always look at the menu before I go to a restaurant, and if it's somewhere new, I'm probably looking at pictures of what the inside of the restaurant looks like and things like that beforehand. So if I wasn't able to do that anymore, I mean, for me, there's also the added side of things about sort of like being vegetarian and often eating plant-based foods as well. That would be really difficult for me to then be told I can't.
Yeah.
Like, it wouldn't make, like, why?
Yeah. I think they moved away from it now, but I know certainly not that long ago, there were treatment centres that would be forcing vegetarians to eat meat in the treatment centre.
To eat meat?
To eat meat. Like, just outside of like the neurodivergent experience, like a vegetarian being told, no, your vegetarianism is a problem. You have to eat meat. You have to eat what we tell you to. The ultimate loss of control.
Yeah, I mean, I just wouldn't eat it.
Yeah. And I guess another piece here, which is going to clash with a lot of the treatment, is the idea of food rules. Because again, that's seen as very problematic in the eating recovery world. Like, my framework tends to be more of an intuitive eating lens. And I have so many questions, I guess, and wonderings about intuitive eating and how it can be adapted, or even if it is suitable for people who are autistic. So what are your thoughts, I guess, on the food rules piece? The part that wants to know, is it a case of like, I want to know the correct way to eat? Is that the sort of underpinning piece of food rules, or something else?
For me personally, I've always wanted to know what the rules are around food and eating from like a biological perspective. And you know me, I love, like, I research anything and everything. So I also want to know, like, what's the science? So one of the most confusing things I found when trying to eat well, I would say, is everywhere you look, the information is different. And one minute something's good for you, the next minute it's bad for you. You can look at something like the government's healthy eating plate, but then when I've actually researched it, actually there's quite a lot of political elements behind what you are told is healthy and how much you should have of something a day. Different countries have how many different portions of fruit and veg. Like, here it's 5. I know in some countries it's like 8 or 12. Like, it's really, really high. So I'm like, can somebody just tell me what to do, and then I'll follow the rules. But there aren't any. And I find it really surprising that in this day and age, nobody can say, take the biology of, a human being and say what we need to eat to live, a healthy sort of life, to look after our bodies, essentially. So I find that so confusing, which probably causes me quite a lot of, I don't know, would I say food anxiety, or would I say, and I probably leans more into like avoidance, actually, more like, well, if you can't tell me, I think I've said to you before, like, trying to decide what to have to eat is a big paralysis point for me. Like, if someone says, like, what do you want to have for tea tonight? I'd just be like I wouldn't be able to decide, which is why I have a food subscription box, because that's just so much easier for me to just pick, and then I sort of know what to do. If I was left to my own devices, my diet would be pretty terrible. So I often think things like that are quite an accommodation.
And I guess it could go the other way with hyperfocus. So the hyperfocus could then be because you said you go into a place where you're like, well, I sort of avoid thinking about it because it's almost unfigure-outable.
Yeah.
And I know, because you've said to me before, and you said it was okay for me to say it here, that there is a part of you that feels like you have the capacity, or there could be a vulnerability to developing a clinical eating problem that you've been quite aware of, not, not giving energy to that part.
Yes, I've often thought, and yeah, I don't know if this is the right way to phrase it, but I've always felt I have a sort of vulnerability to developing an issue around food. And I've been sort of so aware of it that anytime it arises, I actively try to not go too much into it, or I end up researching something. And as I say, because I'm I like to know the facts. And sometimes I've come across certain facts that have just made me, oh, okay, like not go down certain routes that maybe other people might do. But if some people's special interests, for example, so autistic people often have really quite passionate interests that they might spend a lot of time on understanding, researching, doing. If that becomes about food, nutrition, exercise, that could go to quite a difficult place for some people.
Potentially making something like orthorexia a risk.
Yes, definitely.
Maybe we could touch on monotropism, because this is a real overlap with the binge eating that I work with. In terms of, once the mind becomes fixated, it's very difficult to change tracks. I think even for the neurotypical people that I work with, because there's something with the binge that creates this monotropism. But maybe first of all, in case someone hasn't heard of the word, what is monotropism?
So essentially, firstly, anybody can have monotropic thinking, but it has become quite a prominent sort of like theory of autism, in that autistic people are very monotropic thinkers, which basically means quite one-track minded. If you think, for example, of like a motorway, it's like when we're on the motorway, like we can do like really well on that one thing that we're doing, but we might find it really hard to get on the motorway. So something called autistic inertia, which is about like starting a task, like being able to transition from doing one thing to moving to another thing. And the same with getting off the motorway. So coming away from it. So transitions can be difficult sometimes for autistic people, but when we're on one track doing a thing, we can maybe like really focus and do that thing amazingly well. So I think thinking how that might come into it with food and what you do is quite an interesting idea, particularly with binging. So if you're on this motorway of eating food, how difficult is it going to be to come off that track and stop what you're doing?
So I would say that when I was binging, that it's like once your brain has gone, this is happening, right? It's already beginning. You are planning, you're doing whatever it might be. It would be like a feeling of inevitability that it's gonna happen. And it was such a knowing that any possibility of stepping off that track just felt impossible. I wouldn't say that I felt that in all other areas of my life. It felt very specific to this problem. This was how it was showing up for me. Is that similar to an autistic person perhaps experiencing in other areas of their life? Would how I'm describing how that feels, does that resonate, or do you think it would be, you describe it slightly differently?
I think I probably, describe it similarly, but I don't know whether we'd even, I can only really speak for myself, but I think it's hard to even know that you're on the track and struggling maybe to get off.
Yeah, whereas I think potentially because of the distress involved when you're being pulled into the binge, there might be more awareness than perhaps if you were, I don't know, doing an activity or something that even you enjoy, or a task or something like that. So maybe there's
a difference there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yes, because I've never had experience with binging in any way, I wouldn't really know how I might think of it in that specific situation. But of course, in autistic brains, you are likely to see that monotropic way of being in all areas, not just in relation to, say, food. Yeah, for example.
Another common situation where people are struggling with food is transitional eating. So food becomes a transitionary object to like switch gears, if you like. So travel is a big one as well for some people, particularly who struggle with overeating or compulsive eating. There's certain situations when you're going from A to B where your mind is just just telling you to eat, or getting home from work, or the kids have just gone to bed and there's a decompression that's happening. And I know that for people with I know for autistic people, the challenge of transitions, is a challenge. The challenge of transitions is a challenge. Is that something that you've seen with food? Does that make sense to you, I guess?
It makes sense to me, but I am struggling to apply it from transitions perspective in autistic people. So from struggling to start something or stop something. But with the example you gave about, for example, getting home from work being a transition and using like food, so tell me if I'm understanding you right.
Yeah.
People get home from work and then they go to eat food as part of the transition of getting home from work.
Yes. It's okay to come home from work and just have something to eat when you get in as well. Like I don't want to be like, if you're in a transition and you're eating, that's always what's happening. But some people really relate to this, especially with the working from home.
Okay.
So like that switching, it's like a switching gears. And one of the ways I talk about it is we have different versions of ourselves. So who I am sitting here with you is a bit different to who I might be sitting with a client, to who I might be with family. Like there are slightly different versions of ourselves that show up. And the switch being is transitioning from, let's say, parent mode into alone time, or alone time into parent mode. So a big one for me, because I'm an extrovert, that transition when I have had a lot of activity around people and then I'm suddenly on my own, I definitely used to binge to deal with that feeling. And it wasn't that I minded being on my own and I always crave company, because I don't, but the transition of going from with people to being on my own still even now brings up a feeling that I don't even have a name for. It's really uncomfortable. And I have to distract or do something until that passes.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's not really something I've thought about too much. I'm partly wondering if maybe like safe foods could play a part in that, but whether or not that's part of doing something and then needing to, let's say you've done something that feels slightly like dysregulating or something, and then you want to help return to a place of regulation, maybe as part of that transition, then I could maybe see where food would come into it.
Yeah.
There, but it'd be really interesting to see if any autistic people watching this pick up on or relate to anything that you've just said.
It could tie with nervous system regulation as well. Like when you need to switch gears in your nervous system, which could even be like bringing it up a notch. So eating something, I've had my own experience, I can relate to it, and I've definitely heard it from clients as well. The idea of needing to sometimes binge before they can then get up and do the things that they need to do. So they're in this state of inertia, they binge, and then they'll get up and get the things done that they want to do. Even procrastination is like a type of transition when you're trying to go into something else, and food can be used as a way to deal with that procrastination that's going on before the task has to be done. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot in terms of my content and how I talk about recovery is I talk about a lot moving away from black and white thinking into grey and more flexible thinking. And of course, one of the traits of autism is the literal thinking, and that thinking is generally thought to be less flexible. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So any form of, I don't really like the term, but like cognitive inflexibility, rigid ways of thinking. So yeah, literal thinking, black and white thinking, and then more, rigid or inflexible thinking is, part of the diagnostic criteria for autism.
So how would it be for you then if you were watching a self-help video online, it was talking about something you're having a problem with, and it's some annoying neurotypical person who's like, oh, well, you just need to start thinking about it like this and just think about it more like that. What kind of reaction is that likely to elicit in you?
Probably a frustrating one, because it's not that straightforward and it's not that simple. And it's not that autistic people can't think. in the grey. I think, people of all neurotypes will struggle with black and white thinking, for example, in different areas. But us autistic folk are a bit more prone to black and white thinking, and maybe need to put a bit more, maybe be a bit more mindful to try and bring in the grey and bring in other elements. I know for myself, when I was first considering that I might be autistic, seeing things like literal thinking and black and white thinking I didn't relate to at all. I've always jokingly said, oh, I see the world in like multicolour, from the perspective of it's quite overwhelming that I consider things from every single possibility. That actually creates a problem a lot of the time. So I first saw that and thought, oh no, that doesn't describe me at all. And it wasn't until people pointed out specific examples that, yes, in certain situations, largely when it comes to people and understanding people, I think about things in all the colours of the rainbow. Maybe because that's always been my interest, and hence I'm now a therapist, so maybe that's part of that. But in other areas, I can be very black and white. So, and for anyone who's not sort of sure what black and white thinking is, it tends to be right, wrong, all, sort of like nothing, perfect, failure, and missing in between. So where that can come in with food, so relating that to food, we might really struggle with these are good foods and these are bad foods, and sort of not see the in between.
Yes. Well, Live Label Free, who I mentioned earlier, I'm going to pop her details below because she's a great account to follow. She spoke about her eating problem. She can almost remember the moment it happened, when she was at school and they were learning about different kinds of foods, and they spoke about cake as like, this is the bad, naughty food that will make you gain weight, and an apple, this is the really good, nutritious food. And she said in that moment, it was almost like something just clicked in her brain, and her brain took that information in a very literal sense. And that was kind of the beginning of this polarized thinking really latching on around food and leading to a lot of problems for her later on, which she's thankfully recovered from. I also wonder, when I think of the effort that might be required for a neurodivergent person to change in this area, do you think, because you used the word effort before and then you stopped yourself and you sort of said mindful instead. But there's something about this stuff when you're trying to navigate neurotypical spaces, help spaces, that it's going to be harder work. And there's an unfairness about that.
Yes, there is an unfairness about that. Well, I think, where the unfairness part, I think, comes in is that there is so much information out there that is provided by neurotypical people, or the research is based on neurotypical, like brains. And so the frustrating part for me is where people with different neurotypes can go to get information that is specifically going to help people with the way that their brain operates. And so we do need more like neurodivergent content creators. So we mentioned Live Label Free a few times, but neurodivergent people creating content for neurodivergent people, but also research. We need more neurodivergent researchers researching with neurodivergent people. So there is a frustration in terms of the lack of information that is like really for us. And also, I mean, when you first approached me about doing this video and having this conversation, one of the things that we mentioned is how great it would be for neurotypical content creators to actually be thinking about, okay, how might this apply to people with different neurotypes? Because I think you said to me, how can people watch like your content and take what they need and sort of like leave the rest, or how can they figure out what works for them? I think it's great that you're trying to think about, okay, how can I incorporate this more into what I'm doing? And at the same time, a reaction it triggered in me is like, oh, why do we have to unpick apart and make the extra effort to figure out how something applies to us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And one of the reasons why people watch my content and listen to me is because I'm talking about things that I have lived experience of. So there's the professional experience and the lived experience. And of course, from a neurodivergence or neurodivergent lens, I don't have that lived experience. So anything I say is going to be something I've learned and then try to reiterate, which I think always, it doesn't connect in the same way as well. So in fact, if anyone is watching this and you know of accounts, like neurodivergent accounts that are talking about this content, please put them in the comments below. In fact, I'll pin a comment so people can list them below, because we need more neurodivergent voices ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. But I still think that, yes, we need more neurodivergent voices, but it would also be great if all content creators maybe thought about, okay, how might this apply to different neurotypes? And that's not always going to be an easy, straightforward thing. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, like, our brains work differently, but, you know, we're not of different species.
Yes.
So you know, a lot of people, when they think about autism and they think about like the spectrum of autism, because that is often how it's spoke about and defined, a lot of people think that, well, everyone's a little bit autistic, right? And the truth is, no, you're either autistic or you are not autistic. But autistic traits are human traits.
Yes.
So you are going to identify with elements of autism, because everybody will have autistic traits because they're human traits. It's just the level of traits. How many of those things do you relate to? So neurotypical content can absolutely still help and support people with neurodivergent brains, but it's just sometimes it's not always going to be applicable or helpful, because it might just not work with how our brains operate. And being mindful of that, I think, could be really helpful.
So would it be a case of then me more explicitly acknowledging that when I might be making a point in my video about something?
Yeah, I think so.
You know, because what I really don't want is people listening to my content, trying to apply something, not being able to, and then blaming themselves. Creating more shame is only ever going to make the problem worse for someone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really depends as well on where people are in their journey, for want of a better term. So the person that made the comment on your video, for example, that person is, I thought that was great that they were able to identify, okay, I see that this doesn't sort of like apply to me. But other people might not be at the stage where they can see that yet, and might more be thinking of it from a I'm wrong perspective. With the literal thinking front, another way that might come into it is, for example, meal times. A lot of autistic people might have certain routines in place to support them, and the rigidity of those routines is going to be different for different people. But if you think about meal times and times of day, some people might have a lot of anxiety around like eating at the time they feel like they should eat, and what happens if they can't, or if that time is missed. Is it wrong to eat certain foods at certain times of day? So you know, I know of a few people that, like, for example, wouldn't eat what might be deemed a breakfast food for lunch.
Yeah.
It's like that. No, that's a breakfast food.
I do like winding you up with that sometimes, because I will sometimes have like my dinner leftovers for breakfast. It's like, what?
That's not breakfast. So if, for example, a certain time of day is missed, then you might just then skip that meal until the next time you can eat. And the same is true with, if you go somewhere and your type of food isn't available, then you might just choose to not eat.
Yes. I want to talk to you about intuitive eating, because the bedrock of intuitive eating is about getting rid of the food rules. It is about having permission to have all the foods. And it is about becoming more internally regulated, which is about listening to your hunger and your fullness, which, as I'm sure you can tell, I can see by your face, like there's already going to be a huge amount of challenges around this hunger and fullness, interoceptive awareness, which is the capacity to be able to sense and interpret what is going on in your body. That is often a challenge for autistic people, right?
Yes, so for some autistic people typically tend to struggle to pick up on body signals. Conversely, sometimes people can be hypersensitive and be very aware of what is going on in their body at any given moment and might pick up on the subtlest of changes too, but still might not necessarily be able to interpret what that means. So when it comes to interoception, it not only includes being able to pick up on the body senses, but also then interpret, take meaning from then what that sense is trying to communicate with you. So there's like those two parts. And so some people might have like hypo awareness and hyper. Many things in autism tend to be about the extremes on either side. So again, speaking from my own experience, I really struggle to pick up hunger signals. I can struggle to know when I'm full until I am over full. It's not until I have eaten too much that I then realise. And the same with thirst. I don't often pick up on when I'm thirsty. Sometimes I question whether is it I'm not picking up on the signal, or is it my distractibility that means to being pulled in different directions that maybe I've noticed, but then I've got distracted and now forgotten about it. So I'm not sometimes sure if it's the interoception part or the distractibility part. But either way, sometimes, particularly if I get really absorbed in a task, it can get to tea time and I think I've literally not put anything in my mouth today and I'm dehydrated and wow, my throat is as dry as anything and probably quite desperate for the toilet at that point as well. So yeah, it means without realising it, I have like restricted and not ate, the entire day. I've not had any food or drink at all. And it's quite confusing to me when other people might say things like, oh, I'm getting a bit of a headache. Oh, I'm not eaten it for a few hours. I best go get a snack. That's an alien concept to me. I wouldn't even know how to. I'd just be like, I've got a headache. It's a bit weird. Let's go get some tablets or something. Yeah, I wouldn't really know what that meant. And one of I think sometimes my body is trying to communicate stuff with me so strongly that one of the ways I pick up on when I'm really thirsty is I'll suddenly start to get a craving for watermelon, of all things. I like watermelon, but I'm not like particularly, it's not like a favourite food or anything, but I'll suddenly be walking around the house thinking like, I really wish I had watermelon in the fridge. I wonder if I could get hold of some watermelon. And then I'll suddenly realise, no, your body is trying to tell you are dehydrated and it's after the water content. And then I think, oh yeah, I've not drunk in ages. So I guess sometimes my body, poor thing, has to go to quite certain lengths to communicate like, okay, we're thirsty.
Yeah. The watermelon's basically a red flag going up saying, you need to drink something.
Yeah.
Maybe eat something. Who knows?
Probably both. Yeah, I don't know. And I know a lot of people can struggle with this, but telling the difference between hunger and thirst as well can be tricky. Yeah.
Because I mentioned to you the other day, and you didn't remember this, but we were at a Christmas market once, and we were going to get some, I don't know if it was like this little pancake thing or crepe thing, something like that. And I remember saying, oh, actually, I'm going to have that, not that, because otherwise I'm just going to feel a bit of... And I remember you going, how do you know, how can you do that? Just think about what you're going to eat and realise that one is going to make you feel like this and one is going to make you feel like that. There was something about... Because there's so much of this that's thought as well, which I think if you're not used to, or not used to, but it's challenging for you to know when you're hungry, hunger can come like thoughts, because hunger's going on in the brain. So quite often when people binge, sometimes it's a result of restriction, which is a type of hunger, but it doesn't necessarily feel like, oh, my stomach's hungry. It feels like an obsession in your mind that you have to go and do this. And I think that there is, in the public rhetoric around this, a lot more talk about autism and restrictive and not eating enough. Yet I'm seeing, because I've been on Reddit, there are a whole bunch of autistic people who are saying, I struggle with overeating because of the fullness part. because I don't know when I'm full. I can't tell when I've had enough. And that even sometimes not feeling hungry can lead to confusion, a sense of, oh, I don't know if I'm supposed to eat. Maybe I better just eat in case. And the last piece, I'm throwing a lot in one question or one statement, the last piece being about the food needing to be right. So it'd be difficult to leave an odd number, for example. Maybe wanting to finish it to clear something, to have that sense of completeness and all of that, which I just feel like autism and overeating, I'm not seeing that being spoken about much.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because a lot of the conversations around autism are particularly in relation to more the restriction side of things. And we know that there is, a lot of autistic people have difficulties around food, and that is being spoken about more. And when people go to seek professional help for difficulties around food, more and more places now are almost like screening potentially for autism when people go to get support because of the high incidence rate. But I think restriction is spoken about a lot, and I think ARFID is spoken about a lot. But overeating or binging is not something I certainly see spoken about a lot. And I definitely identify with overeating from a not necessarily picking up on the fullness signs until it's so far that, like, I feel unwell and now I'm really bloated. And it's not until then that I think, oh, okay, probably had a bit much. And going back to an earlier thing we spoke about in terms of like rules and things like that. So not with all meals, but with some meals, I eat my food on my plate in a particular order. So because I want to try and look after myself, I make myself eat. So let's just take a British favourite of a Sunday dinner. I will eat the vegetables first because I know I need to eat vegetables. They're good for me. I don't not enjoy vegetables, but they're just neutral to me.
Yeah.
So I will eat those first so I know I've had the healthy bit. And my favourite foods I save till the end so I can like really enjoy them. But what that ends up meaning is that because my favourite foods are at the end and I eat the foods I think I should eat first, well, by that point then I've probably got quite full, but now I have to eat my favourite food at the end. And so I can end up then, and I'm definitely eating my favourite foods now of all the foods I should eat.
Yeah.
So that's an example of where my rules around the way I eat my food on my plate can lead to overeating.
What would happen like inside you if someone were to stand over you and basically like trying to force you to eat it all together and to mix it up? Like even the thought of that, like what's the reaction? What does your brain and nervous system do at the thought?
So for me, that's less about like food being like mixed from a texture perspective. So for some people that is about mashing smells and flavors, and some people like to have their food not touching and separate. I don't mind mixing some things up. For me, that's more about for me that goes into more, I guess, black and white thinking. That's more about what that would feel wrong to me.
Right.
So one of the biggest things I have is this sense of something being like right and feeling right in my body. And if someone was to tell me to eat it out of my usual order, I would just feel really uncomfortable because in my head it's like, but that's not right. That's not the right way to do it. That's the wrong way to do it.
So there is a tool that is very, very commonly used in intuitive eating, in treatment programs, all kinds of things for eating issues. And we call it the hunger scale. And this is supposed to help people learn to become more in touch with their hunger. So I'm just going to show you the hunger scale there. And I'm curious about, one, I guess your reaction to it, what it brings up, the thought of having to try and figure out from a number perspective where you would be on the scale at any given time.
Okay.
Whether you would have any sense of whether this is even a trainable thing. Like, again, this is going to vary from person to person. I'm not suggesting there's a sweeping answer for everybody, but is it possible then to become more in tune with your hunger? Or are those pathways just not available? But also like the cognitive processing of looking at a scale like that and having a practitioner say to you, So where are you on the hunger scale, Carly? It's a screenshot, so you won't be able to scroll down to read all about it.
Oh, okay. Well, I need to know all the facts behind the scale. Okay, so the hunger scale is a tool that will allow you to gauge when to eat and how much food to eat. Use this scale before, during, and after meal times. So the idea is then you give yourself a score before, during, and after on your level of hunger.
Hunger and fullness.
So yeah, 1 going from empty, 5 to neutral, 10 beyond full. If you were to ask me if you were to put food in front of me now, I'd struggle to. I'd be able to say like I'm a 9 or 10 and beyond full. But
Okay.
so I'd be able to, because that's the only time, as I say, I can identify when I'm like, oh, I've probably ate too much there. See, neutral.
Yes.
Not hungry or full.
Yes.
Is how I feel all day. So I'm just neutral. Like right now, I've not really late lunchtime, and I've not really ate anything. I don't have a desire now to eat food. I don't have a feeling. I think, oh, it's lunchtime. I probably should get food now, but I don't feel any feelings about food. So I'd just be saying that I'm a 5, which, according to this, says, well, the body has enough energy. So, okay, so if I took this literally,
Yes.
yeah, I'd be thinking, well, I'm neutral. I'm not hungry or full. My body has enough energy. Awesome, I don't have to eat then.
Yeah.
I'm all right.
Yeah.
But I'm not, because I just know that I'm not. Because you have to, I guess I have to learn to think cognitively about it rather than intuitively about it.
Yes.
So I would find this hard, and I can think logically about it. But if someone else was to struggle to do that, they could take that quite literally and interpret that as, oh, I'm fine, I don't need to eat then.
Yeah.
Would be one thought. But one of the things that you said is about like learning to recognize more signs, and I have done sort of like reading around this. Just like all brains, when we talk about neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new pathways and learn new things, or change or unlearn the way we do things, all brains have the ability or have plasticity and are able to change. So, for example, myself and a colleague of mine, Chloe Parfit, run a late identified adults autistic group. And in that we have a section on interoception, and we have an interoceptive tracker, which looks at your physical sensations and your emotions. And in that helps you to plot whether you are sort of like in the middle of being able to pick up on things, under responsive or over responsive in terms of what you pick up on. And so we can learn to be more in tune with our body. It is a skill that we can pick up on, develop. Just as much as this can help neurotypical brains, it will help neurodivergent brains. It's a skill that we can all start to learn. But whether or not that it might be a longer process for neurodivergent brains, I'm not sure. But using something like a tracker can help gauge where you are on those individual items and actually see if you can improve it.
Yeah. It also sounds like, from what you're saying, to be able to understand your own process, as in where you currently are at. Because this can look aspirational. You want to get to the point where you can do this, but it could also be a tool for just you identifying, for example, actually I look at this and I think I would be a 5 pretty much all the time unless I'm up here at a 9 or a 10. Well, straight away, that's information about yourself, which you probably had already a fair bit of insight into that, but somebody else, when you're talking about being hypo and hyper interoceptually aware, sure, why not? This could help as a starting point just for understanding, and then there might need to be some cognitive, okay, how am I going to handle this, knowing the challenges that I currently have with identifying a lot or not identifying enough what's going on in my body.
Yes, and as we always say in therapy, knowledge is power. You know, it's that classic cliche, but it's
as
true.
long as you don't use it to beat yourself up, because that's the other thing that happens. People will increase their self-awareness. I see this around my work. They'll increase their self-awareness. They'll understand a bit more about why they do what they do, And then the frustration comes in that I understand this, like I can see what I'm doing, and that gives me more to beat myself with. And I just want to name that in case anyone's doing that, because you could have looked at that and gone like, oh my goodness, I'm always a 5. What's wrong with, do you see what I mean? I'm frustrated with myself that I'm always a 5. I should be this and I should be that. So the knowledge piece without some compassion can be dangerous.
I think that is a really vital point to make with this, because especially if we start to bring things like perfectionism into this, which again, a lot of autistic people struggle with, sort of like perfectionism and having very high standards and high expectations of self, whether or not that then becomes a measure within which we're not good enough and we have to be like this. I think that's a really important thing to make, because how I interpret something like what you just said would be, let's say I am always going to struggle with picking up on hunger signs, and there might be some things. So I might not pick up on a headache as being I need to have food, but if I'm aware of it, I might then think a headache, could that be telling me I need to have food? So being aware of it means that I might be able to increase my awareness a bit, but also it might just be something that I always struggle with. So using that knowledge, I might then say, okay, I need to make sure every 3 or 4 hours I've fueled my body in some way. And so you might have to think about it cognitively rather than intuitively, but then you can still put plans in place for yourself.
You've used the word previously, maybe not in this conversation, the word accommodations. So that might be something that we could think about in terms of what accommodations do you know of that could really help an autistic person who is struggling with interoceptive awareness, maybe overwhelmed by food rules. What are some of the things that have helped you, or any other things that you think could help somebody else?
So I think because routines can be really important for autistic individuals, and some people have their routine written down. They might have it in pictorial form in terms of, okay, this is the routine I follow in the morning, this is the routine I follow, my evening routine. If people were to introduce, okay, I need to make sure that I'm trying to drink enough, eat enough, it could form part of something like that, or using an alarm-based system. Alarms, I'm saying alarms, and then I'm like,
you hate it when people say alarms.
Yeah, thank you. I do hate when people say alarms. But like the answer to everything is alarms, and I've just said it. But sometimes they can be helpful, but they are not always the answer. But for some people, they might be. So I am going to mention using alarms. But if you get annoyed by that, I do too. So yeah, alarms. But again, because I'm autistic and ADHD, I desperately want a routine and really struggle to maintain one. So I have tried, oh my God, I've had so many different versions of written routines, alarm-based routines, app-based routines, writing routines on blackboards on my fridge. So many different things, and I really struggle to stick to them. There is never like an answer that is going to fix and solve it. I feel like I'm always looking for the answer, and it just doesn't quite exist. But trying, I think so much about finding accommodations for yourself is experimentation, finding what works, finding what doesn't, or finding what works for a bit. Okay, it might not last forever, but if you've managed to drink better for a week, you've still managed to drink better for a week than not at all. And I guess that's sometimes where that compassion comes in. Well, I had a good week of drinking. That doesn't mean like I've now failed because I've struggled again this week.
Obviously, one thing about the hunger scale is that it offers numbers in order to be able to mark where you're at. Even if you're not sure where you're at, you have this like barometer as such. And I know that numbers can sometimes have a lot around them for autistic people. And when it comes to food, there's so many numbers we're thinking about. We've got weight, clothes size, calories, macros, all these different things that could be tracked. What are your thoughts, I guess, on tracking with the potential for like that to become an obsessive thing for an autistic person?
So, like we sort of touched upon a bit before, there's the whole, if that really becomes somebody's interest, then they could become quite fixated, I think, on following like the rules within which they've come across, and then that could specifically relate to the way in which numbers are used, and where other people might interpret numbers or be able to use them as a guide. Some of us could almost see them as like absolutes. This is the thing, and not necessarily think about it in terms of what's right for their body. So there's lots of guidance with numbers, but if you're someone who's like really small, for example, it doesn't all, those numbers don't necessarily always translate, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So again, for some autistic people, not all, some people can be quite really interested in or find themselves really drawn to things like numbers and dates and things like that. And there is a lot of numbers around eating, whether that's calories, whether you're talking about the sizes of clothes. I think I joked with you just yesterday that I'm so glad that clothes sizes come in even numbers. Because if my clothes size ended up being like an odd number, like I probably would pick either side and not pick an odd number sized clothing. So there's that clothes sizing, and then of course there's numbers on a scale, and just how that number like feels to you like as a number. So there could be quite a lot that might come into it from a control based perspective around numbers. I guess touching upon control, it's not really a word we've like named as such as we've been talking. It feeds into a lot of what we've said. But control tends to be something that is really important for autistic people, because we live in a world that is often not set up for us. We're around, environments that are too bright, too smelly, too noisy, not in our control to kind of change that. We have to go, we live in a capitalist society that says in order to be of value, we have to be able to work and contribute and do the 9 to 5 and do all of these things. And so we have to fit in and try to just go along with what the world tells us we should be. And so trying to establish anything that could just be ours to control can sometimes feel quite important. And I think that's where food can come into it for some autistic people, as that being one thing that might be within their control.
When I talk about control, I always talk about control as basically safety seeking. Like we need control when we don't feel safe. So the more unsafe we feel, or the more threatened we feel, probably the more drawn we are to control. And when you put it that way, with all the things that are outside of an autistic person's environment, that's kind of almost like bombarding all the time, to be able to grasp control here and there, like the importance of that from a safety perspective. Because control gets a bad rap, because the people around it might not like the fact that you're trying to control something, because they're like, well, this doesn't fit in with what I want. But yeah, I always, when people judge themselves for their need for control as well, always reframe it as safety seeking. And I guess you did mention it, but I do want to just mention it again, that you and another autistic therapist run groups for autistic people to come together, like a therapeutic space for autistic people, run by autistic people. That to me is just much needed. So I will pop the details of that below in the description. If anybody relates to this, wants to find out more about Carly's groups, you can go to the links underneath this video.
And I think one of the things that we're literally just starting as well is a community, an online community for, again, late identified autistic individuals who are still trying to uncover and learn all about themselves, the ways in which they have tried to like fit in all areas of life, what we might call masking. And I mean, there are so many things we've spoken about already, and we know there are so many things that we're not going to get a chance to talk about. I'll almost watch this back and I can always imagine myself like shouting, being like, we didn't say this. Yeah. So there's so many things to talk about that I think if you can find community wherever that is, I think that is something that's really important for autistic people, particularly late identified autistic people.
And I just want to show our audience the difference in mine and Carly's process here. Like these are my notes for our conversation today. And these are Carly's notes for our conversation today. And I don't think we maybe got to about a third of what we hoped to talk about today, but I think we're going to have to bring it to a close there. So yeah, if you need any more information or support, we will be linking to everything we can think of to link below. But thank you very much, Carly, for having this conversation with me, and thank you for watching.
Thank you. Bye. How do you end things?